Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Sorry about that small technical issue at the start. This is Manoj Kulwal, and I am your host for today's session. Today's webinar is on the topic of regulatory visits, training to test. And in today's webinar, I have two experts with me. One is Dr. Jimmy Hinchliffe, who has a lot of experience in the operational risk area, and he is also the chairman of the England and Wales chapter of IOR. And the second expert speaker we have is Lydia Bailey, who has a lot of extensive experience on the regulatory side, both working as a regulator, but then also working at regulated organizations. So they will be sharing lots of guidance in terms of how do we prepare effectively for the regulatory visits. But before I hand over the floor to them, I just want to set the scene for today's session. So the webinar is for 90 minutes, and then we'll make it into a discussion format. So please do post questions. I'll keep an eye on any questions. And if your questions are related to what our expert speakers are talking at that moment, then I will ask the question during the session, and then we'll leave the last 15-20 minutes for any generic questions. The slides and the recording will be available in the members area on the IOR website. So with that, let me hand over the floor to Jimmy and Lydia.
Great, thanks very much. Manoj. So a brief sort of background to me. So I first got involved with the actually with the predecessor to the Institute of Operational Risk in about 1998. That was the Operational Risk Research Forum, and then I've been involved with the IOR since it was set up in 2004. And as Manoj says, since the last 2 years, I've been chairman of the England and Wales chapter, and we run about 8 events or so a year. Outside of the IOR, my background, I've about 20 years in regulation and operational risk. First at the regulator, the FSA, and then at the Japanese GSIFI, MUFG, and then for the last 3 years, I've been an independent consultant, mainly working in operational risk. Lydia.
Yes, well, I'm, again, an ex-regulator. I was a regulatory risk specialist and carried out over 90 visits, focusing on systems and data issues, working on trade risk team and operational risk team. I've also been interviewed by the regulator when I was head of compliance and found it a lot more difficult than I thought when I was a regulator. Since then, I've also worked in a number of firms and helped probably over 70 visits. So I've seen both operational risk topics, but also regulatory visit operational risk in action, through quite a lot of my career. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see a credit to Unicorn. Unicorn Training have provided the screenshots and the video clips that you'll be seeing as part of this webinar. And it's one of the things, their tool is one of the things, obviously, you can use to help mitigate regulatory visit risk.
Thanks, Lydia. And if I give a brief intro to myself, so I was first involved with the predecessor of the Institute of Operational Risk, which was the Operational Risk Research Forum, which was set up back in about 97, 98 by Brendan Young, and then with the Institute of Operational Risk since 2004. And as Manoj mentioned, for the last 2 years, I've been chair of the England and Wales chapter, and we run about 8 events or so a year. Outside of the institute, I've got about 20 years experience in operational risk and regulation, starting off at the Financial Services Authority in operational risk, bank supervision and Basel II. And then I worked for a big Japanese bank, MUFG, and part of my remit there was around a regulatory visit, management and regulatory affairs. And then for the last 3 years, I've been an independent consultant, mainly focused on operational risk.
Lovely. Well, let's kick off. The agenda for today, we're going to talk first about different aspects of operational risk in regulatory visits. We'll then do a bit of general context. We'll then talk through the stages of a visit, pulling out operational risk issues and their potential mitigation. There will be time for questions at the end, but what we'll try and do is take questions at the end of each section, because there's some quite chunky sections in here, and it will mean you won't have to save up your questions till the end. We're also going to try and be very practical, and you'll see some practical examples as we go through, and it's going to be quite interactive with more than the normal number of polls. So to set the scene, we're going to do 2 quick fire polls. Manoj, would you bring up poll 1 for people? So, in recent years, do you think the frequency, probing nature and depth of regulatory visits has substantially decreased, somewhat decreased, stayed the same, somewhat increased, substantially increased? So hit those buttons, please, and we'll see what the feeling of the attendees is on this.
Lydia, while we wait for people to answer the polling question, I just wondered, what kind of challenge is it managing regulatory visits? Just thinking in terms of the volume. So, I mean, you worked at a large tier 1 organizations. What sort of volume of visits would you be getting in a year?
Well, a couple of years back, we were getting about one just in the UK, about 1 major visit a month, and probably over the year 90 plus other meetings. So we had 6 people working flat out, managing the information requests, preparing people, managing the information afterwards. So it's extremely intensive,
yeah,
and it's a key part to putting over the firm. How's the polling going, Manoj?
Another question.
Lovely.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. I mean, I substantially decreased. I would be surprised. I think it's interesting because I think some areas have seen more increase. So particularly immediately after the credit crisis and the few years after that, the focus on liquidity visits obviously boomed, and I think is now somewhat tailed off. So it's going to be interesting. I very much agree that it's somewhat increased or substantially increased. So shall we go to the next poll and see how it's impacted operational risk in particular? So in recent years, do you think the focus on regulatory visits on operational risk has decreased, increased? So yes, and I was going to say, in terms of intensity, what I found working in regulatory management at the time of the split from the FSA to the FCA PRA, at the time of the split, I put in for a doubling of my staff numbers, and everyone laughed me out of court. But 18 months afterwards, I did an analysis, and I actually found, in terms of number of meetings, visits, requests, it had actually increased 3-fold rather than 2-fold. I think showing, increased depth and intensity, and that trend I think's increased.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Somewhat decreased. Yes, it's interesting because it's even more skewed, and I would say that accords with my experience. When I was in the regulator on the op risk team, we were called in. It was relatively small specialist op risk team compared to today, and the supervisors, if I'm being a little bit rude, would sometimes maybe doze off in the more operational risk flavoured meetings. But now it's full square and centre of all that they're doing. The operational specialist teams are much bigger. I attended, like many others, the OpRisk Europe last year, and there was Linda Nelson coming along giving a keynote speech, and I think it's hugely much more central than it's ever been before.
And it's good that we had those answers to the first two polls, so I think we can proceed with the rest of the webinar. It's clearly a
hot topic.
Indeed.
Hot topic.
Indeed. Okay, so what I wanted to do first, next few slides, before we really get into the meat of the webinar, was just to give a bit of context, because I think even though the IOR's been around for a long time, and Manoj has been running these webinars for a long time as well, I think this is probably the first time that we've really addressed this topic of regulatory visits. And some people may be saying, well, this is a little bit strange. Why is the Institute of Operational Risk looking at this topic? I think there are at least three very good reasons why operational risk professionals should be focused on this and should be interested in it. The first one is that, of course, regulators may well come in and they may well focus on operational risk topics, and I think that's that was kind of the result of the second poll, really, wasn't it? And nowadays, and we'll talk about this a bit more on the next slide, I would argue that actually the operational risk topics are actually the ones that are top of the regulators' agenda. So actually, it's a great time to be an operational risk professional. The second reason is, of course, that regulators may well come in and look at the operational risk framework itself, which is obviously a key role for the second line operational risk function in terms of that framework, the operational risk framework, and particularly for the larger organizations, for those P1, C1 firms, there's still a lot of visit work that's done to look at the operational risk management framework. And then the third reason, of course, and this is the main focus of today's webinar, is that actually, the process of doing the visit, of managing the regulatory visit, is of course a source of operational risk in itself, part of the kind of the regulatory risk bucket, if you like. And of course, regulatory risk is generally in that top 10 or the top list of risks when we do the polls, which leads nicely onto the next slide. So we had we always like to be hot off the press at the IOR, and of course we had last week the RiskNet release their annual survey of top operational risks, which is always something that I look forward to reading. And again, this just gives you a sense on some of those the hot topics. And well, I guess one of the things I'd say around this, and it links to a conference that I was at last week, the New Generation Operational Risk Conference, and the chair of one of the streams on the second day said that last year technology was a footnote, whereas this year technology was a whole stream on the second day. And I think this is sounded out in this list of top 10 risks. The fact that you have IT disruption, IT failure in there in the top 3, as well as data compromise, which is a heavily technology-based thing. And data management as well. I've also listed out there some of the hot topics for regulators. For a good few years now, operational resilience has been a really key priority focus, particularly and initially for the PRA, but now increasingly for both. And of course, they had the DP out last year. Huge focus of attention, particularly for banks. SMCR and accountability. Again, it's been a huge focus, and we have accountability 2 coming up towards implementation in December this year. And again, so we have a lot of review work around that, and we have the FCA going and doing stock takes for that first wave of the firms who implemented SMCR. Culture and governance continues to be a big focus for the FCA in particular. Financial crime, of course. data security, resilience, vendor management continues to be really a hot topic, and you'll see that there. That's always on the top 10 risks. Conduct, of course, the big hot topic post crisis. I think initially launched as some kind of a new risk topic. I think many of us have realized, if we didn't at the time, that actually conduct is just part of the wider operational risk universe. So you don't need a separate operational risk framework, a separate conduct framework to address it. Regulatory reporting and transaction reporting, we always see this being a big focus of regulators. And of course, who could forget, particularly at the moment with the chaos going on and the continuing farce around this, Brexit, which has been a big focus for all firms and the regulators for the last 3 years or so. So just in summary then, I think there are very good reasons why operational risk professionals, operational risk managers should be focused on this topic and should be interested in it, both in terms of a second line oversight perspective, as a fundamental source of operational risk to the firm, and because it's quite likely that the operational risk team itself will be involved in a supervisory visit at some point, either the framework or part of a visit looking at one of the hot topics. I just mentioned there that the intensity of visits from both the regulators on the hot topics of operational risk have definitely increased, which again is supported by the first 2 polls. I've already gone through some of the topics there, and just to mention, I think the reviews of operational risk frameworks have probably been slightly less frequent than they were before, but of course the operational risk framework will often be covered as part of SREPA reviews with many firms. So just finally then, the final bullet, today's webinar will focus on these 3 different dimensions, but particularly around the operational risk around the process of managing and running regulatory visits.
Now, we're just about to move on to the next section, because we're getting into the meat of the context. Are there any questions before we move on?
So there's only one question at the moment around the source. So for the top 10 risk, we have the risk.net was the source, but for the regulatory hot topic, was that from a specific source or was that your understanding? And
no, that was just my
okay. So it was not from any specific source, that list.
That's right.
Yeah, that was the only question.
So. Okay, great.
Lovely. So talking about context, the title of this was Training to the Test. So why has it got that title? In the US, and I know we've got a few US people on this webinar, regulatory visits are called exams. And I must admit, I hate this terminology, but I think actually it's quite a good metaphor, because if you think about a regulatory visit, and this is not just the regulatory visits done in the UK, but the sort done in the US, done in Asia, done in, across Europe, it tends to be an information request. So if you like, a team written exam where the firm's got to contribute, and then a series of meetings, a team oral exam. And the trick of these sorts of regulatory visits is actually this is an extremely artificial way, artificial context for getting over what your firm does well. And it's hard to do well without having this sort of exam technique, because you can't just be yourselves, otherwise you don't get over what you do well. And as I say, I think most of because we've got some global people on the call, I think the vast majority of regulators use similar sorts of techniques. So what we're discussing here is going to be relevant. We've already touched on changes to regulatory visits. I mean, all the regulators post-credit crisis have got more proactive, more intrusive. They're challenging on topics that weren't touched before. In my day, one would never talk about remuneration, but now, we're much too polite, because now it is a topic that's touched on, and firms are challenged on. Conduct is another one. I think also the style of visit. I mean, here in the UK, we're seeing, even with the biggest firms, more thematic and cross-firm visits. And these are less tailored to a particular firm, so harder for that firm to manage. I'll talk a little about the problem of misspeaking. We'll go on to misleading as well later in the seminar. I was speaking to someone at another major firm who was ex-FCA, recently left the FCA to join their regulatory liaison team. And he said, what I couldn't believe, Lydia, as a regulator, is the number of awful things people said. And what he meant was not awful as in the underlying facts were awful, but the way people said them was awful. And I can't agree more. But having been interviewed myself, I know it is quite easy to say an awful thing without meaning to. I'll give you just one example. As a regulator, I was pressing an audit department on an issue, and they were a bit on the back foot, and they sort of laughed nervously and sort of said, ha ha ha, you know more than we do. And I thought, oh, what an awful thing to say, because once an audit department has said something like that, of course, you can't ignore the fact there may be weaknesses in the third line oversight. You have to prove to yourself that that's not the case. It not only impacts day-to-day supervision, but if there's an issue, obviously you have to treat it in a different way. So just one misspeaking like that, a regulator can't ignore. So it is really, really, really critical. Complexity and fragmentation. Obviously, we now got 2 regulators in the UK rather than 1. I think handling multiple regulators is an increasing challenge. And the good and bad news is they talk to one another more. So you might think, excellent, it's more efficient. They all come, they all join one visit rather than us having 3 separate visits. But I think it does make the challenge of managing those visits more tricky because you've got people with different perspectives. And also, if you inside a firm, particularly a bigger firm, aren't talking across the different regions and businesses, the regulators are talking more than you do and are seeing connections between issues and then getting ahead of you, which of course is something you never want. So Jimmy and I will sort of like do a double act on this in terms of getting it wrong. There's the obvious additional actions. They might ask for additional projects, additional work to be done. Obviously, there can be more specialist team visits, Section 166, it ratchets up. Obviously, there's impact on individuals, and I will talk about a case of that later. And I think the regulatory relationship and managing that is really key to managing down your regulatory risk. Benefits of getting it right, it's much more of a dialogue. The regulator's much more likely to be flexible. So if we think about the example that I gave, this this awful response from the audit department, as I say, not only will the day-to-day supervision be more intense, but when that issue occurs, that is when it really bites, and when you really find that the regulator is forced to be less flexible because they can't trust the firm itself. Now, I think what we'll do is we'll move on to 3 more quick fire polls, and this is on regulatory management and your organisation and the interaction with second line op risk management. So poll 3, if you don't mind, Manoj. So in your firm, is overall management of regulatory visits and meetings centralised in compliance, centralised in risk or other function, split between regulators? So, for example, the FCA is done by compliance and the PRA is done by finance or risk, or distributed, managed by the business or function that's impacted. Now, I know my personal preference is to have it centralised, because, as I say, the regulators are speaking so much to one another. If you have a more decentralised model, it's really hard. And for risks such as operational risk that all the regulators are interested in, we're saying both the PRA and the FCA are really interested in operational risk, but with different different perspectives. I think, interesting.
It is centralized.
It is
Yes.
largely centralized, although there is, 30% has got, some splitting or decentralized. So I think that actually needs more managing. It's interesting.
Is that decentralized in risk a surprise? Is that it's that high, or is that
Well, again,
expected?
it's interesting because obviously compliance historically was part of the legal department. Sometimes it's, in its own. Sometimes, obviously, it's part of the risk department. So it may be some of those centralised in risk is where compliance is underneath the risk department.
Yeah.
Interesting, though. Interesting.
Yeah, and a recent trend, Lydia, I've also started to see is a lot of organizations, they've started merging their operational risk and compliance into one department.
Yeah.
Is that something you're also starting to see? And what's your view? Is that sort of a good move for the industry?
Which, of course, may be the explanation for this. So, I mean, a number of organizations have said, well, actually, compliance risk is just part of operational risk. Therefore, it should be part of that function.
Yeah.
And then the answer here could be, well, it's centralized in risk
Yeah.
rather than not centralized in compliance.
Yes.
But do you see that, is that something a lot of organizations are doing, or is that an exception?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's been a trend in the last probably 4 or 5 years to see more of that integration of compliance into risk, recognizing that it's all part of the same sort of non-financial risk bucket.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, let's go on to the second poll. Sorry, poll 4, the second one of this lot. That's right. In your firm, does the second line of defence operational risk function provide oversight of regulatory risk, yes or no? So we'll just see what people come back to on that. So you're going to go exercising those fingers today. But it's really useful. I think it's useful for other people on the webinar to see where some of these things are moving.
Okay, so the votes are still coming in. Let's give it another 10 seconds.
Righto, no problem.
Okay, so it is settled now. So let's share that. So it's toss of a coin.
Very
interesting. Now, I must admit, I thought that the yes votes would be higher.
This doesn't surprise me at all, actually, because well,
it is. Don't get me started.
Because this is one of those interesting cases where you have an activity which is typically done by a function that sits within the second line. So it's sitting within compliance predominantly, but also within risk. But they're actually doing rather than overseeing. And that often becomes a bit of a blind spot, where the second line doesn't provide oversight of functions in the second line doing first line activities.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Shall we move on to? It's fascinating. So we move on to our fifth poll.
Sure.
In your firm, does the second line of defence op risk function provide oversight of regulatory visits and meetings and their management? Yes or no? Now, I must admit, I'm expecting the yes to be lower here, but we'll see what people come back with. For those people who are doing it, then I think this webinar is going to be particularly interesting because they'll have more questions that they can ask people afterwards. So it's going to be well worth. Yes, and that's higher actually than I thought. That's pretty good at 21%. Interesting, very interesting.
So was this the organizing the meetings, or
no?
Not organizing the meetings,
no. You would imagine like somebody like compliance or a regulatory management group would be organising the meetings and running around and doing the project management and the prepping and et cetera. What I think this is saying is that the second line of operational risk function, have a look and see how that management is doing. Is it being effective in helping to maintain a good relationship with the regulator and manage down the regulatory risk? That's what I think the yes is saying. And that actually is I think that's very positive. Right, so let me just make sure I can take back control here. Again, not talking about Brexit, but of the webinar. I would just say before we finish this section, it's really important to think from a regulator's perspective, not only in terms of issues and themes that they have, but think about their view of the regulatory visit process. For a start, I would say that regulators find visits stressful, and you think, well, we find them stressful. But from a regulator's point of view, they're going in your firm, they're on your territory, you're throwing all your best people at them. You know, your people know everything about the firm, particularly if they're risk review people. They know very little about your firm. It's very easy for them to look stupid. So they find it stressful. And the regulators themselves have actually got a lot of operational risk, a lot of reputational risk, because regulators can and do go into a firm, give them a more or less clean bill of health, and then some awful issue pops out of the woodwork in the next week or month. So at the very least, they're the laughing stock internally, but it can reflect badly on the regulator itself. There can be post-mortems internally or even worse externally on some of these things. So they are in a stressed situation and trying to manage their own risk. They have, and this gets back to the regulatory visit being a really artificial test. They only have a very limited view into the firm. They can only form judgments based on what they see or hear. They will tend to extrapolate. If there's a problem, they can only assume that this is a general problem because they've got no evidence otherwise. And they have to be cautious about accepting what a firm says at face value. They don't think you're lying toads, but they can't just, if you say, oh, we've got a wonderful op risk framework, they say, all right, tick. They have to probe and test that, otherwise they wouldn't be doing their job. So before we move on from the general context, are there any questions?
Not at the moment, Lydia.
Righto. So let's be practical. You've already received notification that you've been, quotes, invited, unquotes, to take part in a thematic review. So here's your information request. It's a thematic review on operational risk management, focusing on new business products and transactions. So great. And here is the pre-visit request. Now this is a very typical sort of request. And this, if you think of the exam analogy, this is the team written exam questions. And as is often the case, a lot of the challenge is, well, what do the questions mean and how do we answer them? Something like org charts, you think, oh, it's simple. But if any of you have ever managed a regulatory visit, they're rarely up to date. They often show solid lines for second line of defence people reporting into business heads. There's always some reorganisation coming up. Something as simple as that often is quite difficult. Copies of internal policies relevant to this visit. Well, which policies do you choose? You say, oh yes, new visit approval, new business approval process, easy. But then you think, well, does that cover the full range of what they're looking at? Well, actually it doesn't. There must be other policies like, reputational risk policy, unusual transaction policy. And then you think, well, is it obvious how those link together to form, to meet the risks of these new business products and transactions? Do you need to put a gloss on it? So again, you have to think very carefully in terms of how you answer this exam question to put your firm in the best possible light. Op risk self-assessment process, and something we haven't talked about, but nowadays both the PRA, FCA, and I think other regulators increasingly are going further down into the organisation, into the middle and lower layers to test it. So what they often do is they select a business line or a product or a deal and delve into that and pull the people in at last moment. So obviously here you've got the risk of choose a business line and maybe the detail of their self-assessment process, and you just hope they choose one of the areas that do it well. Papers and minutes from key operational risk committees. Where is it? First line? Is it second line? Do you do both? Do you put it in the context of the governance system? Board extracts. Well, sometimes you don't have any board extracts for what they want to hear about. So then you think, well, what do you do? Do you say there's nothing? Do you think of something else, like say, oh, well, there was the ICAP discussion which touched very briefly on operational risk, or was there a NED briefing on something? copies of relevant audit reports. What do you choose? Do you avoid the bad audit reports, or does that show the strength of the audit department? What exactly is relevant to this request? Now we're going to then get you another poll to sort of see what you think about, again, a seemingly simple request, a list of material UK operational risk incidents in the last year. And we won't worry about material, definition of material, but the poll is, what does UK operational risk incident mean? So P&L impacts it, trader, marketer located in UK, customer in UK, booked through a UK entity, though the P&L switches out to another entity. What do people think? And this is just the sort of challenge you hit. And then you might find, well, do we go to our op risk database? But then you might find the legal entity identifier isn't very good in there, or you don't know how to define material. Do you go to some completely other way of getting at material op risk incidents, like seeing what's been escalated to key committees? It really is, a seemingly simple question like this can be really quite tricky. How's our responses going, Manoj?
Okay.
Are people thinking?
Yes.
People thinking about this?
Lydia, as well, I think on this point, as with all these things, it's about getting organised quickly, isn't it? And
Yeah.
early, because inevitably there are always going to be things where you think, well, I don't quite have precisely what they're looking for,
Exactly.
but I may be able to give them something a little bit different that meets the same objectives.
Yeah.
And then having that conversation with them early.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're not coming to them the day before it's due and saying,
Yeah.
I can't deliver this.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Now, I would say I am not sure what the right answer is. And I think to some extent it depends on the regulator, because the PRA might be much more interested in the P&L impact, whereas the FCA may be saying, well, if the customer or the market is located in the UK, they'd be more interested in that. What I would say is when you approach these questions, you have to think about, and again, get back to, exam technique, answering the question, what does the regulator really want? What's behind the request? What practically can you provide in the timescale they've asked? And then hopefully there's some rough intersection somewhere. And then obviously you come to an agreement to the regulator to say, you asked for this, I think you're really wanting this, we can provide this. Will that be okay for you? But, it's a real art and science trying to do this. So let me just then carry on. So obviously you need to consider these requests, this written exam. Are there any questions, issues? Almost always are. It's a huge project management task. Sometimes the regulatory management team can get other people to project manage it. Quite often they're project managing it themselves. If you think, then at the very least they've got spreadsheets and they're saying, these are the different items. These is who's got ownership of them, and quite often nobody wants to take full ownership because it splits across business lines or functions or whatever. You often need discussion with the regulator. You need to make sure in your project management you've got somebody who's going to sign it off before it goes to the regulator, somebody suitably senior. Obviously you need interim deadlines and then the ultimate deadline. I always used to how shall I put it, be slightly economical with the truth and give an internal deadline that was a little bit earlier than the regulatory deadline, because they were always last minute issues. And the last thing you want to do with the regulator is miss a deadline without warning them. You don't want to be at 20 to midnight with somebody saying, well, I'm not signing off, I think there's a problem in it, etc., etc. Delivery of information sounds easy. But again, if you think about, exam technique, if you just have a whole jumble of files, the regulator thinks, well, great, what relates to what? It needs to be really well organized, readable, very clear with indexes, what relates to what, how you've answered the questions, what assumptions you've made. If they quite often ask for printed versions, you don't just send it to your print and copy shop, because, it always prints off in either so small they can't read it or goes off the edge of the page. Everything needs to be, really presentable, more than you would do for any normal client. It needs to be, ultra beautiful, so that the regulator, when they pick this up, think, sigh, yes, I can follow this, that's really helpful, excellent.
Lydia, some firms have the approach of going for volume, so they will send over. I mean, I remember being a regulator, you'd receive sort of this huge box of 5 or 10 LibreArch files. What do you think of that approach? Is that something that works?
I think beware. I've been on the receiving end, as you have, as a regulator, of CDs full of information, CDs full. But if you're a diligent regulator, you read them all, and then you go in to the meetings and you say, on page 1364, it says X. And of course, the firm hasn't read all the information and they're caught out. So I think the purpose of this is, it's a bit like, when you're doing, I'm showing my age, when you're doing A levels and you're trying to answer a question, you don't put down everything you know, because that isn't a good answer. What you try and do is put down things that are relevant, that, show the firm in the best possible light. So I absolutely think, less is more if it's telling the right story.
Lydia, what should you do if there's something you just don't have? And almost it's a little bit embarrassing that you don't have this document, or you don't have this in place. You don't have an operational risk policy. Well, how should you manage that in terms of engaging that with the regulator?
Well, I think this is part of, first of all, when you get your visit notification, even before you get your pre-visit information request, it's worth doing a quick SWOT analysis and saying, strengths, weaknesses. Where we've got weaknesses, is there something that we ought to do even before we get the information request and the visit? So if, for example, you haven't got, in your example, an operational risk policy, I would start a project to create one. So at least when the regulator comes in and asks for it, you can say, we haven't got one at the moment, but we're working on it. We're expecting to deliver one, in X. The key elements are expressed in these documents, but formalizing the policy, blah, blah, blah. There normally are things that you can do instead, but do be very careful. So, for example, I was assisting one firm where they'd asked for recent compliance reviews, and the compliance department had been in a bit of a state of tiz, and they hadn't really got any compliance reviews. So they gave all the control meetings for the last 6 months or year, which of course had lots of things in them that the regulator could ask. So I think in your desperation to fill a gap, do be careful. Don't think very, very carefully about it.
I think the worst approach is that kind of head in the sand approach. Hope the regulator doesn't notice the absence of the policy in the pack.
Yes,
that's
they will notice. They absolutely will notice. And I think also, and this gets back to, it's a team exam question, it's really worth somebody, even if they don't look at every document in detail, having a scan over the whole to see, does it hang together? Because quite often you get information request responses where people have obviously not talked to one another, and it gives a really messy impression of the firm. Just again, pre-meeting preparation in terms of the visit organizer, whether it's in compliance or risk or whatever. Obviously, think about the areas of focus, do your SWOT analysis, consider an aid memoir. So this is really a little crib sheet, because when you're under pressure, and for the UK people, it's it's like when you're in the mastermind chair, people forget their legal entity governance, they forget their recent relevant training. They forget the key policies. So if you've given them a little crib sheet before to remind them, hopefully it's there in their minds. I think obviously you need to hold briefing sessions. I always like them headed by a suitable senior to say, listen up, chaps, this is important. You need to focus on this.
Something we used to do, Lydia, I remember, is produce, a similar kind of aid memoir type thing, but we called it the data bank. So you'd have some of those key facts and figures.
Yeah.
What's the size of the balance sheet in the UK? What's the
exactly.
head count? All these kind of key things that can be just thrown into the conversation, which is really powerful.
That's right. And we'll sort of talk later, but sometimes, if it's going to be a visit talking about the customer journey, you know, you need to know what your complaint stats are. You know, there's some really obvious things that ought to be in these sort of aid memoirs. So in terms of the people who are being interviewed, obviously they need to read, you know, the relevant stuff to them that's been sent to the regulator, read the aid memoir, consider Q&As, and we'll come on to that in a lot more detail. As I say, prepare as a team, not only within your own function, but because people are going to be asked similar questions. It's no good if the risk team say one thing and the business say another, and product control say something completely different. And always, 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 always have memorable examples that you can use. You can waffle on about, and I've waffled on in my time, about policies and processes, but if you can give some punchy examples, the regulators can write them down when they're challenged back at the ranch. You know, why are you comfortable that their processes are working in practice? And say, well, they gave me this really good example. You know, I've checked with other people. It seems to be really operating well from the examples they gave.
Lydia, one question around this. You see sometimes some, you know, compliance or functions, they effectively try and script the senior people who are going to sit down before the regulators. What do you think of that as an approach?
I don't really like scripting. I think you need to be clear, you know, what are the key messages? What are the key things you think as a firm you do well, and make sure those come over. You need to be conscious of your weaknesses and how you're mitigating those or controlling those or doing things to improve them. But I think it's miles better if people say these things in their own words. So I think some of the key messages people should have, but they shouldn't be reading out the key messages. So yeah, that's how I would approach that.
I guess the other point as well is an experienced regulator can spot that a mile off.
Yes. They can spot if everyone sort of parrots the same thing. You know, again, it doesn't come over very convincingly. Now we're going to show you an example of somebody not preparing an example, and what I'm going to say here is don't click until I ask you to click. So just hang on in there. Now what we're doing here is we've got a video clip which will appear in your chat, but don't click it yet. Now this is Gavin, the risk manager. It's his first attempt at a regulatory interview. Now when you've seen the video, at the end you'll see a black screen, which is to allow everyone to catch up. So come back to the presentation when you get to that. But if you can go into the chat window and on your marks, get set, click on the link, please.
Okay, so just something to note, it seems the hyperlink is not going all the way across, so you may have to just copy that whole hyperlink and paste it in your browser. It's the chat window seems to be breaking the hyperlink like 90% the way. So just copy the entire text I have added to the chat, and then you can paste it into your browser URL, and then the video should start. If you're facing any issues, then just feel free to ping on chat.
Now I'm hoping most of you should have finished by now. So as I say, ping Manoj if you've had problems.
So we do have about 3 individuals here who've said they were not able to see the video.
Well, that's not bad actually, out of the numbers. So I'm sorry about that. In essence, what it shows is somebody under pressure guessing at an example of something he half remembered, and then obviously, of course, he's guessed wrong. And I would say it shows 2 things. First of all, it's usually very unwise to guess, but in this case, obviously it's come over really badly because he's guessed wrongly. But even his best option, which was to have just said something high level and say you'll get back to them, doesn't look anywhere near as good as having the example to punctually sort of quote to the regulators, which would make, you know, a huge difference to how they view him. So obviously, prepare your questions and answers, prepare examples. Consider the question behind the question. So thinking about, you know, a business head, is he control conscious, which might be the question in the regulators' minds. They won't ask him, are you control conscious? They will ask him a series of questions and ask others a series of questions to see if that's the case. So when you're hearing these questions, think what's lying behind them. This risks then control mitigation is really, really important. Risk, weakness, control, mitigation. Risk, control, risk, risk mitigation. If people did that, then a lot of the hairs that start running wouldn't start running, because people talk about risks and then don't mention the control. And then the regulator spends the rest of the visit trying to find out what the control is for that risk, and maybe nobody tells them. So they think, oh dear, they've got an uncontrolled risk. So really important to do that. I think, and we'll come on to here, types of questioning. I think you need to think, because it's very similar to a press interview, except it's worse because it's a group exam, oral exam. But it's similar to a press interview. You've got a very short length of time. And I was trained as a regulator in questioning, and you know, if you listen to the Today programme, they're trained in questioning. So the person answering has to be good at answering different types of questions. So we'll just cover quickly a few of them. So funneling questions, I loved these as a regulator. So these are X and Y, so why not Z? So your project management record's poor, you've outstanding issues, you've got no contingency left. What makes you think you can meet the deadline for, you know, moving to the new system safely? And then the regulator will leave a big silence and wait for you to fight your way out. Closed questions, do you have a risk framework? Obviously you can say yes, but it's probably better to answer them saying yes, and the key elements are ABC. Repeated questions, we've touched on this. This is a, you know, again, one of the standard regulatory techniques, asking questions of, you know, risk of the business, other people, audit, see where the discrepancies and gaps are. Clarifying questions. When you hear a regulator asking for clarification, it may be because they're worried about something, it may be because you or others are unclear. You know, it should set alarm bells ringing. Leading questions. Again, the, you know, how many times have you overridden your board? To which the answer should be none. But you know, beware of those. Are you seeking to, you're looking to dominate the market? Oh yes, great revenue opportunity. You know, not the right answer. Open questions, again, are a really, really powerful regulatory questioning technique. And we'll move on to, and again, hold off before you click, please. And I'm sorry for the people who've had issues. If Manoj can sort you out, he will. But if not, I will recap so that you can have a look.
Yeah, so I have pasted a URL, and this time I've shortened the URL, so there are no gaps in the URL. So I think most people should be able to open this one.
Brilliant. So just hold off clicking for a moment. So here what we're doing is, after the initial first attempts, there's in the Unicorn training, there's a guidance section, and this is a clip from this section just talking about how to answer open questions. So on your marks, get set, click, please. It's always difficult to know how long to give everybody with different internet speeds, but hopefully you've all come to the end of the clip. So there you can see, those of you hopefully saw it, they were using, Bernadette was using in the second example, was using the risk or weakness control mitigation technique. So obviously, if somebody asks you about a weakness, you shouldn't try and evade it because that looks awful. If somebody asks you about a weakness, you look it straight in the eye, say, well, this is a comparative weakness, but this is how we get comfortable. So here's some of the possible question areas in terms of, that could be asked in terms of the operational risk framework.
Yes, I mean, one of the things you do in terms of your pre-meeting preparation is really just to sit down and say, what are the key topics that they may well look to cover when they're coming on site and look at, in this case, the operational risk framework. And we've just listed out a few there, risk appetite, governance, challenge and operational risk from the board, and then getting really into the nitty-gritty of the taxonomy, the risk language, and looking into the tools, recognizing defense escalation, and of course the system that's been used, whether that's a GRC or whatever. And of course, what you would do is you would look at the different topics, and then you would consider what types of questions you could have on these different topics. I think you have some examples.
Yeah. So in terms of, not just the, as Jimmy said, not just the question areas, but how the questions could be framed. So they could ask open questions like 3 greatest operational risks. What are the weaknesses in your op risk framework? They could use a funneling question. So, your second line operational risk function is very small. The business don't like the operational risk self-assessment. No one can articulate the op risk legal entity escalation route. What makes you think your op risk framework is fit for purpose? They can ask a question via asking for an example. Give me an example of challenge by the second line op risk function. And again, they'll ask the op risk function, but they'll also ask the businesses and others for examples. And if people don't have examples, obviously they'll draw their own conclusions.
And of course, that's the technique that they always use, isn't it? This kind of triangulation.
Absolutely.
So they will ask the same questions to multiple different people, and then compare the answers.
Compare and contrast. Exactly. So this is, it keeps saying about how it's a team exam. Yeah. It really is a team exam. Now, that is quite a chunky section. So are there any questions on that?
Not at the moment. Not at the moment, did you?
Righto. So the meetings themselves. Now it sounds quite silly, but getting a meeting room, a suitable meeting room, is a nightmare in itself. A lot of operational risk. Obviously, you need a meeting room for a day, day and a half. It needs to be big enough to take all the regulators that want to attend and your people. Potentially, it's got a telepresence facilities needed. So book early. I always like them in a nice neutral area. Again, as a regulator, I've been in meeting rooms where, as you go to the coffee area, you wander past the back office. Yes, it's got a keypad on the door, but you see that the doors are pushed open. So it's an obvious point for your visit. You don't want regulators wandering through your dealing room willy-nilly. People might be standing up talking on their mobiles, so again, avoid that. And I've seen, again, wandering to coffee areas near my regulatory meeting room, posters up talking about the recent severe system issues that I hadn't known about before. So a nice neutral conference area is ideal. I would say have 2 rooms, one for the regulators and the meetings themselves, and another nearby where you can host people that are coming into their meetings, so they have a chance to not stand in the corridor and wait, but sit with somebody, get a bit of last minute sort of prep and briefing, and obviously be debriefed afterwards. With conference line telepresence, if the regulators want it, then obviously fine. If internally you want it, I would say think carefully. If somebody's going to say anything substantive, they're better off in the room where they can judge the regulatory mood much better than you can over even the best telepresence. If they're just being on the conference line or telepresence just to hear what's going on, I would say, well, why? They don't need to. I would also say that when it's, when the local regulator is looking locally, they don't want too many people from outside the region flying in dominating the meetings, because they want to see that the local teams are strong, particularly second line teams. Teas, coffees, obviously the US regulators, you can't feed them, but I would say generally make sure the regulators are, got nice biscuits, chocolate brownies, whatever you want to give them, and potentially offer them a sandwich lunch, because you really want them to feel as calm and relaxed as possible. If they've overrun their morning meetings, they've got to rush out and get a sandwich, eat it, ultra fast, go into the afternoon. It's much better if the sandwiches come in, they can relax, and they're in a much better mood for the afternoon. So always have them, sort of fed and watered as far as is humanly possible. Presentations. It's very tempting to bring a great long presentation to speak to. Unless the regulators specifically ask for this, I would say don't, because the regulators often see this as trying to grab the agenda, which it is, and they don't like it and will put a stop to it, which sets a nasty taste for the beginning of the meeting. I think a slide or 2, like an org chart or something, is quite nice to hold on to as a comfort blanket, but I would say, unless you know otherwise, don't do great long presentations. Bringing relevant documents, again, as a comfort blanket, it's nice to bring all these documents, but the regulator may ask for one to be handed over, and then they'll ask the poor soul in the next meeting a question about it, which they won't be prepared for. So it's better to, figuratively go in naked and say, yes, if there's anything you want, I will give it to you. I'll give it to you afterwards. I would say always, always, always have a note taker if you can in the meetings. Obviously, in audit or NED meetings, that won't be appropriate. But otherwise, I would do that, because then they can see the flow of the meetings. What are the issues coming up? They can help brief and debrief people. They can also make sure that they're really clear on any follow-up information requests. And at the end of the day, I would always recommend a debrief, either via email or over a call, so that everyone knows what's happening. And if there's a second day, marshal their forces for the second day. And if there are issues, try and stop those getting too much of a run.
Lydia, can I ask a couple of questions? First one is a very practical one. I see a big sort of range in practice on this, and this is about how many people you should have from your side attend the meeting. So you see some firms where they're very comfortable, they just have one person, the main person, who's leading from that side. And you see some organizations where you go into the room as a regulator and you have this cast of thousands on the other side of the table, almost trying to intimidate you into not asking difficult questions. Is there a rule of thumb in terms of the right approach on that?
I would say, obviously, it depends what a meeting is aiming to cover. I think sometimes with thematic meetings in particular, where it's not tailored to your firm, they may be covering things in the meeting that don't suit your organizational boundaries. So you've just got to have, I don't know, product control and valuation group in together, because that's the way they're asking the questions. I think, particularly with control functions, you need to be really careful if you've got a range of seniorities, because almost always regulators are looking to see what the middle and lower levels are like. So if a senior, you see this time and time again, a senior person treats it as a job interview, so, you know, talks non-stop, doesn't let his more junior people speak. They sit there like lemons, looking really, you know, weak and pathetic. And although, yes, he's shown off his knowledge, it hasn't helped the firm at all. So I think, again, you need to think of the purpose of the meeting. So if you've got, you know, a range of junior people who are there to speak to things, they ought to speak. They shouldn't be just comfort blankets to the main person. Is that answers the question?
Thank you very much. And then my other question is one that can be quite challenging. So I mean, we've both worked at the UK entities of big foreign headquartered banks.
Yeah.
And you often find that the regulator from the home country may well want to join the visit. What are some of the additional challenges that poses?
Yes, and it's maybe something we should have touched on earlier, you know, when we were talking about, you know, regulators talking to one another and going on joint visits. Yes, it's more efficient, but it's more challenging to manage. And this is why I think it's so important that regulatory management in firms is joined up, because at the briefing stage, if there's an overseas regulator, you need to brief people on the concerns of the overseas regulator. You need to brief people on the personalities, not only of the UK regulators, but the overseas regulators. So you might have a UK regulator that is, you know, always does it very nicely, and people get lulled into a false sense of security and use it as a therapy session. Whereas, you know, another regulator, like an overseas regulator, might be quite aggressive and abrupt. And you've got to warn people not only of their different perspectives, but potentially different personalities of different regulators in the room. So it does make it more challenging to manage, and it also makes the management of issues coming out of a regulatory more difficult, because obviously it impacts the UK regulatory relationship, also the home regulatory relationship that the firm has. So yes, it is a challenge. It's a real challenge.
And having those early communications with head office.
Yeah.
I mean, the worst thing you want is to have a visit and then for the next day, for your the group head of risk or head of compliance to get on the phone and say, the regulators come and phoned up my CEO and said, we've had this big issue that we didn't know anything about.
I know. I think in when you're doing regulatory meetings management, is there's sort of political skills, there's diplomatic skills, there's project management skills, there's communication skills. There's a lot that you have to do well to actually manage these successfully.
A lot of operational risks.
A lot of operational risks. And something we were talking about before the mics went on, in terms of intervention by the note takers or compliance in the meeting. And I'm a great one for saying that, compliance in the meeting are a safety net around the safety harness. So you have to nearly hit the floor before compliance ought to intervene, because otherwise you undercut the people that are in the meeting room. Compliance can't do the talking for them. So in terms of do's, obviously, what we were saying before, it shouldn't all be scripted. Prepare, but be yourself. Respect the regulators, even if they look like your child or grandchild. I'm getting older now, so I can sort of say that. Particularly the thematic, the people who are doing review visits, they've seen a lot of firms and they've seen more issues than most people who just work in one firm will have seen in a lifetime. So, they do have insights that potentially you don't have. Watch what they're reacting to. If all the regulators pick up their pens and write something down, you've either said something brilliant that they're going to, relay back at base, or something awful that they're going to then relay back at base. Watch how they're reacting. Be open, clear, factual. And sometimes when you're feeling under pressure, you don't know how to answer something, they're pressing you on a weakness, maybe they're being quite abrupt themselves. It's easy to feel a bit emotional, but I think all the time you just have to be, factual, strip it of the emotion, open, clear. Think positively. It's easy to focus, you do a lot well as a firm, but there's a few bits perhaps you're a bit worried about and you don't want them to press on, and you're so focused on those you don't really talk about the good bits in a way that really conveys them. So do think positively. What to do if? There's lots of what to do ifs. If they're unclear in their question, and sometimes you'll have supervisors asking questions and there's so many clauses and sub-clauses in it you can't follow what the question is. So obviously you can ask them a couple of times to repeat it, but it may be better to say, well, if you mean X, then Y, and then they've got a chance to jump in. Sometimes you're not sure what level they want, so it's always good starting high level, saying, do you want me to give more detail? So there's a few tricks of the trade in terms of how to deal with things where you're not quite sure how to go with an answer. In terms of meeting don'ts, obviously avoid acronyms, don't get caught out on material. So again, example of the complaint stats. If you've forgotten the last month's complaint stats and you don't know how they relate to this month's complaint stats, obviously it's not very helpful if you're going to be cross-questioned on that by the FCA in a meeting. Don't exaggerate an answer under pressure. Sounds obvious, but actually it is surprisingly easy to do that. And the number of times I've known firms as a regulator talk about something, when I ask for it, it turns out it's only draft, or it doesn't cover what, all the things that they implied it covered. And of course, it's very embarrassing on both sides. Don't be overconfident. I always used to sigh as a regulator when people said, oh, the senior management team's got 500 years of collective experience and we've had no issues. The regulator's Black Museum is full of firms that have said, oh, we've never had any issues. And then, of course, the next week or next month, something awful happens. So don't be overconfident just because you haven't had an issue in an area to date. It's asking for trouble. Potentially misleading information uncorrected. Now, this is a real life example, not at a firm I worked at, I hasten to add, where the regulators were asking somebody about an AML project. He said, yes, it's 95% complete. He actually meant phase 1, because obviously there was a phase 2, so overall it wasn't 95% complete. I think he was just that terrible impulse to say what they want to hear. I don't think he was trying to mislead, but the regulator had a suspicion he was trying to mislead, so it had impacts for the firm, and it also had impact for him because he wasn't allowed to become a board director of a regulated entity because they had concerns about his integrity. On the right-hand side, Jose's phone is ringing. Well, obviously, you should have put it on silent before it went into the meeting. Obviously, you shouldn't answer the phone in a regulatory meeting, but you would be surprised if there's a number of people on, the firm's side. You find people looking at their mobiles under the desk, or even worse, typing messages on their mobiles under the desk. So it sounds unbelievable, but it does happen. So I would encourage people not to be teenagers and just put their phone away for the duration of a regulatory meeting. I'm just looking at how we're doing by time. We might just have time very, very quickly to go 2 more polling. So this is Jose, the business manager. Project Dynamite New Business, been doing brilliantly, but because they didn't go through the proper new business process, because there was something a bit similar, so they didn't need to. He has been having operational problems. Regulators coming in, he is preparing well. He's decided to have a business cap if the operational stats continue to deteriorate. So let us nip in very, very quickly. So if you can get your fingers on the buzzers, it's yes, no. 7, should Jose bring his business manager to the meeting to speak to business controls? Yes or no? So if you can just click that really, really quickly. Don't agonize, just hit those buttons.
Okay, so that's settled now. Okay, so we'll share the results.
Interesting. I would say it's interesting because I'm absolutely the opposite to most of you. I would say he shouldn't bring his business manager to speak to business controls. He could bring his business manager to the meeting, but Jose, the business head, should speak to the business controls to show he's business conscious. He shouldn't be there sitting about talking about P&L and, you know, how he's dominating the market, and then let his business manager speak to the controls. He should be in there saying, yes, you know, I'm very control conscious, I'm watching this, these are the key mitigations. That's my view. I don't know what your view is.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right, quick fire poll question 8. So should Jose mention the proposed business cap? Again, get those fingers working. Yes, no, you know, yes.
Let's give it another 5 seconds.
Interesting to see what people say. Yes. Now, again, obviously, the context of the context is everything. But my instinct is to say yes, you should mention the proposed business cap, because if the stats are bad enough to to be considering a business cap, the regulators are bound to ask, and it sounds so much better, him as the control conscious business head to say, well, we've looked at these stats, we're going to, implement controls if they deteriorate further. I'm watching it very closely. Is so much better than having it dragged out of him at the end. Well, yes, he's considering it. So I would go with the yes on that. So are there any questions? Obviously, that's a pretty chunky section.
So one question would be around the outsourced vendors. So a lot of organizations rely on outsourced vendors. They may be in the same country as the bank, or they may be offshore.
Yeah.
What is your experience in terms of regulators or these regulatory visits involving people from those outsourced vendors?
I think primarily where it's completely outsourced, they would be looking to ensure that the control and oversight and responsibility obviously stayed back in the regulated firm, and they would have a look at the interface and see what was flowing across that interface and see that the regulated firm had the controls that they would expect. If it's offshored, I do know, for example, the PRA, trucking off to India to have a look at the offshoring facilities and seeing how those work and how it links back to the UK. So particularly in offshoring, then they do sometimes go walkabouts and see offshore facilities.
Yeah. Yeah. And traditionally these discussions have been about business, but now increasingly regulators are also focusing on resilience, where a lot of technology and cyber.
Yes,
so do you see those discussions sort of becoming very technical in those contexts? Because then it's not just business. You may be drilling down into sort of the technical details around the infrastructure, or you haven't seen regulators go down to that level.
Oh, they do, because obviously they've got their risk specialists. Yeah. So they would, bring, if somebody's proposing to use the iCloud, for example, they would bring their risk specialists in to sort of, challenge them on how they're proposing to do this, how they're proposing, to keep control of the things that they would be expected to keep control of as a regulated firm. Yeah. So absolutely, and obviously, under the rules, one of the things that you have to write into your outsourcing contracts is the ability of the regulators to reach through into those firms if they need to.
Yeah. Because that's where, if some of these discussions, they become technical, and then the compliance and the operational risk people, then they don't understand that level of technical detail. Then it becomes difficult for them to know that, okay, what is being discussed in that context. Sorry, Jimmy.
Which I think is the challenge, isn't it, around operational resilience?
Yeah.
Because it is that area that brings everything together around that critical business activity. So you need to bring in the detail people. And then I think it's the opportunity then for the operational risk function to provide that overarching umbrella around the whole thing.
Yeah. But I think, again, when you take a step back, regardless of the technical detail, the firm itself, the senior managers on the under the new senior manager regime or the old approved persons regime, and the board and the NEDs need to have at a high level comfort and assurance that the right things are in place. And it should be possible to distill some of that technical detail in a way that, and some of the challenge on the technical detail in a way that can give comfort to people who have got less detailed technical, because otherwise everyone's flying blind.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? Any questions? Right. So, oops, let me get back, take back control again. Here we go. So post-meetings management, just very quickly, shouldn't be ignored. Obviously, after the visit, there's often a number of information requests that come out of it, and those need to be managed, and they're your last chance to really get over on paper what the firm does well. Expectations management. If possible, it's good to get verbal feedback at the end of the visit from the regulators, but even if not, there are a number of issues that it's perhaps obvious that the regulator's been focusing on. It's good practice to warn people internally so that they can get through the stages of, anger and grief and get back to resignation by the time the actual draft findings letter comes in, because obviously, these are, these can be sort of quite upsetting findings. Obviously, when you get the draft letter, what you're meant to challenge the regulator on is matters of fact rather than matters of opinion. And people often think these findings letters are unfair, but I find that normally if you look at just what the regulators saw in the written exam and what they heard in the oral exam, often if anything they've been quite kind. You think they're unfair because you know the firm miles better, but from what they could see in their very narrow view, they're often pretty fair. Formal findings letters management, obviously you need to circulate it to your board, your audits, others. Some firms are sensitive, particularly with letters with a number of findings, just circulating them on emails generally in case they fly out the building. So obviously just, different firms manage that differently. In terms of the letter response, again, less is more, I think. It's not the time of war and peace or try and justify yourself on everything. I think often, local areas or local functions might be tempted to fight on certain opinions of the regulator, but you have to think, well, first of all, can we win this? Is it worth it? And is it worth it also in terms of the overall relationship? And normally, I would say it's not. So think very carefully about how you do that letter response.
And Lydia, I think it's true that particularly post the financial crisis, that the tone of letters from regulators maybe became more harsh. How do you manage that, particularly when you're dealing with, home country, the head office and what have you?
I think there's still a lot of variation between regulators in terms of the tone of their letters. I think the UK regulators, although they've tried to become more direct, and they have to an extent, I think they're still probably less direct than some of the other regulators. And I think, again, part of the skill in regulatory visit management is knowing the tone of that regulator and sometimes even the tone of the regulatory manager. So, for example, if you've got a manager who's ex-enforcement, he will have a different tone to somebody who's got a supervisory background as a manager. So it does need, the nuance needs to be translated internally by people who do know what that tone means and can position it correctly in the firm. It's quite subtle.
Yeah.
Quite subtle. Are there any questions?
Yeah, so there is one question, Lydia. So the question is, how do you ensure junior staff have experience of meeting the regulator? So if this is the first time they're getting involved in that sort of a meeting, that do you do like mock sessions with them beforehand?
Yeah, now this is, one of the things, this is not a sales, don't want to make it a sales pitch, but one of the things the Unicorn training does, it gives people the ability to have, the regulatory equivalent of press training in a nice, safe environment. They can see things, they can see different styles of questioning, how people do it well and badly, and get that flavour. I think when you're preparing for people for regulatory meetings, particularly the increasing number who are not experienced in that, you first need to train them in the technique, the general technique of managing regulatory meetings and how to answer question styles. And that is quite difficult. And then give them a top up in terms of, well, this meeting is focused on X. If you think about the sorts of open questions you might, you know about open questions, this is how you answer them. The sort of open questions in this visit might be X, Y, Z. I think it's normally impossible to give, except in the very small firms, to give mock interviews to everybody. You know, if you think about, you know, my example where you've got a major visit a month, in those major visits, probably you're prepping about 60 people, of which maybe 30, 35 will actually be interviewed, but because they'll pull in, you know, a deal or a particular product stream at the last minute, you're having to prep a lot of people. So you can't possibly give them all mock interviews unless you've got huge resources. So I think this is why you need to prep people in the general technique and then give them top up. But it's really tough because, you know, that is what is actually critical.
Okay, and then some organizations, well, most organizations have systems where they have information about the risks and top risks and controls, which controls are working, not working. So you can either give an output from that system to the regulator. But have you seen regulators sort of demand that, oh, no, we want to go and directly see the system. We don't want you to give us the output. We want to directly go and see how many controls are working, not working. Is that unreasonable, or?
Well, it's not unreasonable. I think, in my experience, often people like the US regulators who've got more resource, often, you know, come on site and spend time trawling through people's systems more. The UK regulatory approach is to like ask for demos, perhaps do walkabouts, but they, and you know, obviously they will ask for extracts from databases, but they tend not to ask for your own system access and then go in and explore your own systems, just because they're more thinly resourced. But of course, then the onus is on you. It doesn't let you off the hook. You can't not show them the slightly less comfortable bits. You know, if they ask, you know, for a particular area that's not very good, or if they ask for the areas that are showing amber in your risk ratings, then, you know, they've got a legal right to get that information.
Okay, so they can.
Absolutely, they know they've got, you know, the UK regulator can ask under the legislation for any information that they think is relevant to the UK, the legal entities they supervise. So that might be a group audit report that's only focusing a little bit on that legal entity. It might have, you know, 90% of it might be on other legal entities, but if it touches their legal entity or has relevance for their legal entity, then they can ask for it.
Okay. All right. So you got one more slide?
Last slide.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so very briefly to finally kind of recap. So obviously we focus on the areas where operational risk professionals can be directly involved in supervisory visits, and that's where the topic of the visit is an operational risk, or the visit's looking at the operational risk framework. But also, I think importantly, we've set out why operational risk managers should be focused on regulatory visits from an oversight perspective, because there is, you know, a huge amount of operational risk that is coming from regulatory visit management. But I think equally, we should point out that there's also a great opportunity, because if you get this right, then there's huge value in building a trust with the regulator.
Yeah, absolutely agree. That bank of trust and confidence that you build up with the regulator is, you know, it's almost like your most precious asset.
Yeah, it's invaluable.
It's absolutely invaluable. Absolutely invaluable. So really, and we've only got 1 minute left, but are there any further questions?
But I have a slide
to
go,
yes,
so I can take control
no,
now?
please
okay,
take control.
Right. Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you very much, Lydia, Jimmy, for coming and sharing. I think the presentation I found was very structured, where you went through the process with a lot of practical examples, and then we tried videos for the first time, which worked for some, but we've had some issues. So we'll look at how do we resolve that. But I think that's also a good way to share some of the ideas in sessions and the topics we're discussing. So we close the presentation. The recording of the presentation and the slides will be available in the IOR members area. So if you're not an IOR member, please do consider joining IOR. And in the handout section is where you'll find a PDF which has information about IOR membership. And it also has information about the operational risk certification offered by Institute of Operational Risk. So please do download that from the handout area if you're interested. And Lydia has also offered a couple of handouts which you'll receive in the follow-up email, which will come out through our webinar software in about an hour. So you will receive 2 PDF files in that email. And the next webinar in our series is going to be on 2nd May, where we are going to talk about how do risk managers effectively interact with board members in terms of risk-related topics. And we're going to have our expert speaker on that is Richard Pike, who's already a board member on many financial services institutions. So he's going to come and share the challenges from a board member perspective when they have to interact with the chief risk officers and the risk teams. On risk-related topics. And then the next England and Wales of chapter is also an exciting one where we're going to talk about innovative topics in terms of using artificial intelligence and process automation, but in the risk management context. So it won't be an AI topic in general, but more focused on risk management. And that is on 28th March 2019 in London. And information about both of these events is available on the IOR website under the events section. So please do go and look at those details, and you can book for those online. So with that, I will close out the session. Thank you very much again, Jimmy, Lydia, for the session today. Thank you.